It really hits you every day, doesn't it? Just this constant flood of political news, policy
Yeah,
changes.
it's overwhelming trying to figure out what actually matters.
Yeah,
It's tough.
exactly. And that's why we're here, to try and cut through some of that noise for you.
And we've got this great source today, the Electoral Vote News Briefing. It's from April 28th, 2025. So that marks day 97 of the current administration.
Day 97. Okay, so let's really unpack this briefing because it covers a lot of ground, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. It's not just a surface look.
Right, we're talking presidential approval, these questions about executive power getting maybe a bit out of hand.
Yeah, potential overreach, reported missteps, the whole tariff situation, and the economy.
And even, like, new fundraising tactics, party politics, how Canada's reacting. It's all in there.
And what's interesting, I think, is how these things are starting to connect, even this early on.
So our mission here, really, is to pull out the key stuff, connect those dots for you, help you feel informed without drowning in every single detail.
Exactly. Give you that clearer picture of what's happening and, well, maybe why you should care.
All right, let's jump right in then. Public perception. The briefing suggests the honeymoon period, if there was one, might be fading fast.
That's putting it mildly, I think. The numbers show a pretty noticeable drop in the president's approval.
Specifically.
Well, take the economy. That was a huge focus, right? The polls cited average out to around, what, 40% approval?
Oof. 40% on the economy. That's not ideal.
Not really, no. Especially when it was such a cornerstone promise, it becomes a real vulnerability, you know?
And it's not just the economy. Immigration was another big one.
Same story there. One poll shows 51% disapproval on his handling of immigration.
Wow.
And it's across the board, strong disapproval from Democrats, but also a majority of independents weighing in negatively.
Even on specific things, like that idea of sending gang members to El Salvador, the briefing mentioned pushback there too.
Significant pushback, yeah. It suggests maybe a disconnect even with parts of his base on some policies.
Okay, but here's where the language gets really interesting. That New York Times Siena poll uses words like scary and chaotic.
It does. And it says voters aren't really buying what Trump is selling. That feels like it goes beyond just policy disagreement, doesn't it?
Yeah, it speaks more to like temperament, leadership style.
I think so. And look at independents. Only 31% feel he understands the problems facing people like you. That's a tough number.
Because independents are often crucial, right, if they're skeptical.
It makes broadening that appeal really difficult. It suggests the administration might struggle to reach beyond its core supporters.
And the briefing puts this in context. Comparing his numbers now to other presidents around day 97, how does that look?
Not great, according to the briefing. It mentions that even some administrations considered to be struggling were actually doing better at the same point.
So it really raises questions about the trajectory.
Big questions. And you remember all that talk right after the election about a permanent Republican majority?
Yeah, seemed like everyone was saying it.
Well, the briefing notes that talk has pretty much faded away, suggests those assumptions might have been premature.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The briefing also flags these growing worries about executive power.
And the numbers here are really quite stark, actually.
How so?
There's significant public support. We're talking anywhere from 54% up to 76% for limiting presidential power in specific areas.
Like what kind of areas?
Things like ignoring Supreme Court decisions, sending citizens off to El Salvador without due process, deporting legal immigrants just for protesting,
Wow.
imposing tariffs without Congress signing off, even getting rid of congressional programs unilaterally.
So across the board, people seem to want those checks and balances firmly in place.
That's the clear message. The briefing basically concludes voters do not want the president to usurp the powers of Congress. Pretty blunt.
And it mentions the heavy reliance on executive orders for a lot of this stuff.
Yes, and that some of those orders are already facing court challenges. Plus, it points out that some of these big moves, like the trade war or targeting universities,
Yeah.
they weren't exactly front and center campaign promises.
Interesting. So maybe a shift in approach after getting elected.
Could be. Or maybe just leaning heavily on executive authority to get things done quickly.
Which brings us to another section in the briefing, these reported mistakes. It paints a picture of, well, maybe some competence issues.
That's one way to put it. The briefing lists several incidents that feed into a narrative of disorganization, maybe poor judgment.
Like the Secretary of Defense situation.
Exactly. The reports of security breaches, secret war plans on insecure devices. The briefing draws that parallel to the Hillary Clinton email scrutiny.
Right, highlighting the potential double standard, but also the actual security risks involved,
Real risks, yeah. Then there was that Harvard funding threat.
which they then walked back, calling it a mistake.
Right, but as the briefing asks, was it a genuine mistake, suggesting carelessness, or was it, an intentional, maybe authoritarian-style move that they backtracked on?
Neither option looks particularly good, does it?
Not really. And the list sort of goes on. The IRS commissioner thing,
Yeah.
appointed, then fired almost immediately.
Apparently after Elon Musk got involved and then Treasury Secretary Bessent stepped in, seems chaotic.
It suggests a lack of maybe internal coherence and potential outside influence on really key appointments.
And the tariffs. The initial rollout based on AI errors. The Penguin Island tariff.
Yes. It sounds almost comical, but the briefing uses it to question basic competence in just making policy. They had to revise things quickly.
And the president claiming 200 trade deals when there aren't 200 countries.
It just stretches credibility. It makes you wonder about the attention to factual detail.
And some of these things have serious potential consequences, like those budget cuts pushed by Musk.
The ones affecting nuclear safety and power grid security personnel.
Yeah.
That's genuinely concerning.
Especially when the briefing points out the claimed savings were tiny compared to the potential risk, and then they had to reinstate people anyway.
It raises serious questions about the whole decision-making process there.
And if you tie this back to the economy, the briefing notes, negative impacts already showing up?
Yeah, on the stock market, the bond market, the dollar's value, it suggests these policies, or maybe the uncertainty they create, are starting to bite.
Particularly for businesses relying on imports, right?
Yeah.
Seeing costs rise, supply chains getting shaky.
Definitely. It ripples through.
And then on top of all that, there's that, frankly, bizarre story about HHS Secretary Noem's purse being stolen.
With all that cash, blank checks, passport, yeah, it's an odd one. Raises eyebrows.
Plus her showing up at that El Salvador facility with expensive stuff, given the context. The briefing notes, it seemed kind of tone deaf.
It all adds up, doesn't it? The briefing sort of captures the feeling by asking, can't they do anything right?
Which feeds right back into those approval numbers we talked about earlier. It creates this narrative of instability, maybe?
I think so. It raises those fundamental doubts about effective governance and sound judgment.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into the tariffs specifically, because the briefing makes a strong point. Even if they stop tomorrow, some damage is already done.
That's a really crucial takeaway. The disruption, especially with China trade, is already happening. China restricting rare earth exports is a big deal, too.
And you can physically see it, like fewer ships at ports.
Exactly. The briefing mentions fewer cargo ships at places like Long Beach. That's a tangible sign the supply chain is under strain.
So this isn't just abstract numbers. It's hitting businesses, maybe inventory shortages, potential closures.
Could be. And that means fewer hours or jobs for dock workers, truckers, retail staff.
Yeah.
It affects real people.
And that Philly Fed manufacturing survey dropping sharply.
Yeah, because businesses can't get the imported parts they need. That could genuinely lead to factory shutdowns, layoffs down the line.
Plus, businesses are holding back on investment because everything feels so uncertain.
Makes sense, right? Why commit big money when you don't know what the economic landscape will look like next month?
The briefing also mentions the president's negotiation style might not be helping things with China, or even allies like Japan and the EU.
Right, it suggests his more confrontational style might clash with how countries like China prefer to negotiate, which is often more long-term, less abrupt.
And other countries pushing back, too.
Expected resistance, yeah. So navigating out of this trade mess looks complicated. The briefing seems to imply some economic pain is now unavoidable.
So the focus probably needs to shift to just managing the fallout.
Mitigating further damage, probably yes.
Okay, switching gears completely now. This executive branch club, tell us about that. Sounds interesting.
It definitely has an air of exclusivity. Basically, a $500,000 membership fee gets you access
to
the president, other top officials.
Yeah.
It's being run by Donald Trump Jr. and Omid Malik, a big GOP donor.
$500,000 for access. That immediately raises questions about buying influence, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The perception is pretty clear. It looks like a way for the wealthy to pay for privileged access.
And the briefing mentions potential for, like, private deals, maybe even different tiers of membership later.
Yeah, suggesting it could become even more transactional. It kind of feeds into this idea of a two-tiered system, one for big donors, one for everyone else.
which could really erode public trust, you'd think.
You would. While fundraising is normal, this specific model, the price tag, it looks like selling influence, plain and simple, to many observers.
Now, despite all these controversies bubbling up, the briefing suggests Republicans aren't exactly rushing to criticize the president publicly.
Generally, no,
Right.
which makes Senator Grassley's comments on Russia and Ukraine stand out.
What did he say?
He was quite critical, urging a tougher stance, and actually said Russia is playing America as a patsy.
Wow, that's strong language.
It is, especially when, according to the briefing, many other Republicans share concerns about Ukraine, but they're just keeping quiet.
Even senators who are retiring soon, you'd think they'd feel freer to speak out.
You might think so, but it really shows the kind of hold the president seems to have over the party right now.
So Grassley's comments are notable mainly because they're so rare.
Pretty much. It highlights that there are different views within the party, even if they aren't often voiced publicly.
Okay, let's look at the Justice Department. AG Bondi seems to be making some big changes quickly.
Very quickly, yes. The briefing details the abrupt cancellation of at least 350 nonprofit grants,
Worth how much?
about $4.4 billion total. These were grants funded by the previous administration.
Supporting what kinds of things?
A really wide range. Victim support services, mental health programs for police, anti-human trafficking efforts, stuff like that.
So cutting funding for those programs could have a pretty big impact on communities, right?
A huge impact. The briefing specifically mentions concerns about victims of crime, losing access to legal aid, housing, medical care, even help with funeral costs.
Has AG Bondi addressed that?
The briefing notes Bondi stated victim services won't be affected, but, well, given the scale of the cuts, there's skepticism.
And there was another policy change mentioned about journalists.
Yes, reversing the policy that limited subpoenaing journalists to find their sources in leak investigations.
So making it easier to go after leakers?
Essentially, yes. The briefing suggests the priority seems to be punishing leaks over maybe addressing the potential wrongdoing the leak exposed.
How's that going down?
Not well with some state and local officials, according to the briefing. They're worried about the chilling effect on the press and government accountability.
So it feels like a shift in DOJ priorities towards maybe loyalty and information control.
That's certainly one interpretation presented. These changes seem likely to ripple out quite widely.
Okay, even though Democrats are in the minority in the House, the briefing outlines a strategy they're planning. How are they pushing back?
It's a classic tactic, really. Using the committee process specifically, the markup of that big kitchen sink bill the president wants.
The markup. That's where they debate amendments in specific parts.
Exactly. So the plan is to force votes on specific, potentially unpopular parts of the bill,
Like what?
like cuts to Medicaid, or SNP, or maybe tax breaks that mainly benefit the wealthy.
And the targets are?
Republicans in swing districts, especially those sitting on the key committees where these votes will happen.
So they force them to go on the record.
Yep. And then those votes get used in campaign ads for the 2026 midterms. Congressman X voted to cut your health care, that kind of thing.
We saw that work before, didn't we, in 2018?
It was very effective then, yes. So they're dusting off that playbook.
And the narrow margins on some committees mean just a few Republicans flipping could actually change things?
It could, potentially. It adds another layer of pressure. It shows that even in the minority, you can still try to shape the debate and hold the majority accountable.
But it's not all unity on the Democratic side either, is it? The briefing talks about some internal friction.
Definitely.
Yeah.
There's this push, led partly by DNC Vice Chair David Hogg, to challenge older, more moderate Democrats in primaries with younger, more progressive candidates. Hogg's group, Leaders We Deserve, is funding these challenges, specifically in safe Democratic seats.
So the idea is to shift the party leftward from within.
That seems to be the goal. Get more progressive voices in Congress, reflecting what they see as the energy of the party's base, especially younger voters.
And how's that being received by the incumbents?
Not well, as you can imagine. The briefing mentions pushback, and even DNC Chair Ken Martin giving Hogg an ultimatum.
So real tension there.
Yeah. Hogg points to examples like AOC's primary win as the model, and it mentions a specific challenge to Rep. Jan Schakowsky by a TikToker, Katabu Gazala. Schakowsky is expected to retire, but it shows the trend.
It really highlights that ongoing dynamic within the Democratic Party, the establishment versus the progressive wing.
Exactly. These primaries could really reshape the party's future direction.
Now, over in the Senate, Adam Schiff is mentioned as taking a different approach for a new senator.
Yeah, he's not really following the traditional seen and not heard path for freshmen.
How so?
He's been openly critical of leadership, apparently, and he's using procedural tools, like putting a hold on a nominee. That's pretty assertive early on.
Does his background in the House give him more leeway, maybe? Being a lead impeachment manager?
The briefing suggests that's a big factor. He has name recognition, political capital that most newcomers don't.
And he's focusing on oversight.
Very much so. Aggressively questioning nominees, working with other former House members now in the Senate to hold hearings. It sounds like he plans to be a major player in scrutinizing the administration.
Bringing some House energy to the Senate, as the briefing puts it.
That's the phrase used, yeah.
Yeah.
A more confrontational, proactive style, perhaps.
Okay, one more senator mentioned Susan Collins in Maine. Things aren't looking great for her, according to the polls cited.
No, the numbers are pretty brutal. 71% of Maine voters saying she doesn't deserve re-election.
71%. Wow. Is that across party lines?
Yes, majorities of Republicans, Democrats, and independents. That signals a really broad dissatisfaction in a state that used to reward her moderation.
And there are potential challengers lining up.
Strong ones, potentially.
Mm.
Governor Janet Mills, Representative Chellie Pingree are mentioned as possibilities.
So she could be facing a very tough fight.
Looks that way. Although, interestingly, the same poll found a surprising number of Maine voters think leftist politicians are the state's biggest problem.
Huh. So it's complex.
Always is, isn't it? State politics often have their own unique dynamics, separate from the national narrative. But Collins definitely seems vulnerable right now.
Finally, let's look north. The briefing says the U.S. president is actually a big factor in the Canadian election.
A huge factor, apparently. Past comments, current policies, they're causing a stir.
In what way?
There's this reported surge in Canadian patriotism, even a backlash against some U.S. products.
Really?
Yeah. And the Liberals, led by Mark Carney, are predicted to win. His whole campaign pitch includes Trump-proofing Canada.
So the election there is partly about the relationship with the U.S. and specifically the current president.
It seems to have become a major dividing line, almost creating a de facto two-party system based on views of the U.S. president. A big liberal win would definitely be seen as a rebuke.
It just shows how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? Actions here have real ripple effects internationally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Canadian election is a prime example of that.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Looking back at this Day 97 briefing, what are the big takeaways?
Well, we've seen a president facing declining approval, serious questions about executive power and basic competence, an economy already feeling the pinch from tariffs, some really interesting political maneuvering from both parties internally and against each other.
And clear international fallout, like in Canada.
Exactly. It's a snapshot of an administration facing significant headwinds early on, with strategy shifting on all sides and real-world consequences starting to emerge.
Hopefully diving into this briefing like this gives you, the listener, a clearer sense of the landscape without getting totally bogged down.
That's the goal, to connect those dots and highlight what seems most crucial right now.
And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it, about the longer term? What does this level of early controversy and falling trust mean down the road? How resilient are our institutions when faced with these kinds of pressures? Definitely something to keep mulling over.